Welcome back to the Garden Hutch. Today we'll discuss August in your garden. Let's get going. Well, so far 2022 has been rough for almost all of us. So the first thing I want to discuss about August in your garden, it's important to take the first part of August and sort of regroup. This is the last month of summer, so you're sort of in the home stretch, if you will, for most of us anyway, for the absurdly hot, the chances for drought, that sort of thing. Because once September hits, the rainfall increases quite a bit here in the South. I believe it's that way for most of the country. So right now, one of the most important things we can do is just regroup and make sure that we do the basics. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was I realized as I was getting ready for this video that a lot of my tools that I use, they've kind of gotten worn down as time has gone on. And what I mean by that is, like, we use a lot of hand loppers, we use a lot of snips, that sort of stuff in the garden to help trim and that sort of thing. And as time has gone on, just like anything else, they've dulled. So I was thinking about, you know what, that's a great thing to do when it's 105 outside, scorching temperatures, you don't want to go out there. It's a great time to go ahead and sharpen your garden tools, especially heading into where we're fixing to go as far as your plants and the challenges they're going to be facing. It's a great idea to take some alcohol, rub those utensils down really good to make sure that you're not spreading disease from plant to plant. Another thing that we need to make sure that we continue to do in August is to make sure that we maintain our water regimen. For most of the country, August is the hottest and driest month of the year. So one of the things that continue to do is to make sure that all of your irrigation, if you have it on time, all of those things are still going. It's also a good idea during periods of long drought or during periods of extreme heat to go out once your water cycling is done and check and make sure that your plants are getting enough water. Last month, in fact, we had to go up on our watering times just because, we had, I think it was like 14 to 15 days in a row that were over 100 degrees. We went 6 weeks or so with no rain. So we had to increase about 25% of the amount of water that we put into our beds just to make sure that it went far enough into the ground so that it wasn't evaporating. It's another thing to consider. The second thing that we need to continue doing is keeping an eye out for pests and diseases. July was bad enough for pests, especially because of the drought. You had grasshoppers, which generally are a little easier to keep off of your plants if you create some sort of boundary around them without the grass or whatever. But it was so dry, they didn't have anything to eat. So they were coming after our plants. So that was an additional challenge that you had to work out for. Usually August is when we have to worry about grasshoppers, usually for about just a few weeks in August. But this year it started at the beginning of July. So just make sure that you're taking all the precautions you can. With grasshoppers specifically, the easiest thing you can do is just go through your garden and shake them off onto the ground. They'll flee from you and get away from your plants. So a lot of times just being there as a deterrent, you being there as a deterrent. If not, you can take Dawn dishwashing liquid, put it in a spray bottle, and actually you can spray the grasshoppers with that, and that'll get rid of them if that's what you choose to do. If you have chickens like we do, a lot of times we'll just take the grasshoppers and throw them in a bucket they can't jump out of. And then whenever we're done collecting them out of the garden, we'll take those and we'll give them to our chickens. So those are a few things that we need to continue doing throughout the month of August. August is also National Garden Camp Month. Actually, I just made that up. If it's not, though, it should be. What do you think, Oscar? Keeping on the theme of things we need to continue to do in August, trimming your plants. Now, what we do here at the Garden Hutch is at the very beginning of August, I go through and I do an extreme trim, especially on my cherry tomatoes. I'll do that for any of my indeterminate variety of plants. So right now our indeterminate varieties that we're growing, we have our slicing cucumbers and our cherry tomatoes. Other than that, everything we grow is indeterminate because we like to have a spring, summer, and fall. And having the determinate varieties kind of makes that easier to time out. But as I said, the big thing for us in our cherry tomatoes is right now we have picked the majority of the cherry tomatoes from the spring and early summer blooms. So what's important to do now is to go in and just take out all of the old growth so that as we go into August, your tomato plants, they don't have to feed those lower branches that have been on there for a long time. They've been fighting disease and pests and things for a long time at this point, right? So they went in the ground the weekend before May. You know, we're going into August now. So a lot of those lower limbs, they've had a lot of trauma. It's time to get rid of them. It's going to do your plant some good. Another thing that we need to do is take off the clusters. When you go through and look at your tomato clusters, there are going to be large clusters on your cherry tomatoes that'll still have like 1, maybe 2 tomatoes on there that need to ripen. At this point, I take those off. Now, we've been fortunate. We've got a lot of cherry tomatoes. We still have blooms from the newer ones coming on. So we don't really have a break in our cherry tomatoes when I do that. If you would have a break, I would still recommend taking those older clusters out. And again, the reason being is the same thing I just mentioned. You do not want to be harboring any extra bacteria or fungus or anything in those clusters and carry that into August, because August is a very challenging month for gardeners, especially if you have indeterminate varieties of plants that have been in the ground for months at this point. It's really important to do the trimming, and that gives them a chance to make it through August. And then towards the end of August into September, you could very well have a harvest that equals or exceeds your early summer harvest. So on that topic, let's go take a look at the cherry tomatoes. For those of you who routinely watch the channel, you'll know that this area prior to trimming was solid essentially from the top all the way across. So what I've done is I've gone through, and you can see the bottoms, how they're cleaned up all the way through. What I've done is I've gone through and taking out everything from a certain point down, everything that had old growth on it or that had the old clusters. I've left a few. You can see these that I've left on here. And the reason these were left is because, see, there's still the majority of them on there, and they're also towards the extremity of the plant, which means that they haven't been on the vine near as long as the ones, you know, that were populated all through here. So at this point, what we've done is we've allowed airflow through this entire part of, or the bottom part, I'm sorry, of this cherry tomato bed. And I've allowed this side, I'll show you the west side. Instead of tying up the west side, I let this cascade down. And the reason for that is, you know, this is the west side of the bed. So as the hottest part of the day, as the sun sets, it hits on this side. So traditionally, I like to leave a canopy to allow, or to block the soil so it doesn't dry out too fast. Leaving this cascade on this side as opposed to tying it up, it works much the same way. It's not as effective, but you know, a week and a half from now, these tomato plants will go ahead and create their own canopy all over again. So just since we have done the trimming 2 days ago, we have already started to get mass amounts of blooms on the top. And a lot of these tomatoes, these clusters here that weren't finishing off, they have started to do so. But that's just an example of why it is important to trim your plants. And I wanted to show you that I do it, like when I say extreme, I mean extreme, and it actually works out as a boon for your plants. Another thing to consider during August is it is time to start removing your determinate plants. So we just discussed the indeterminate. Your determinate variety of plants will generally live right at 3 months to 3.5 months. So like our determinate variety of cucumbers, for example, they've already started kind of dying off. We're still getting pickles every day. We're getting enough to continue doing our pickling. But they've cut down in about half, right? So before we would put up 6 jars, now we're putting up 3 jars every 2 to 3 days, which is fine. That's the way it's supposed to go. The reason I bring this up is if you're like us and you like to have a fall garden, it's really important to make sure that you take the opportunity in August as your indeterminate plants are starting to die off to remove those and start prepping your beds. Now, we've done a video on this in the past on how we prep our raised beds to plant, but in the summertime it's a little bit different because you don't have as much time to prepare. So anything that comes out, regardless of whether I'm going to plant it in the fall or not, it doesn't matter. I like to make sure that within a few days of removing the old plants that I prep that bed to go into the next planting, whether that be the fall, the spring, or even the next summer in some cases. The sooner we get that done, we get the compost in, okay, so let's talk about how we do it first, and then we'll talk about the reason why. The way we do it is we remove all of plants. Now, if it was a bean or a legume or anything that's nitrogen fixing, as opposed to pulling the plant from the roots, we trim it at the bottom. And if it's something like a tomato or something along those lines, we will pull the entire plant. We'll shake off the excess compost back into the bed that we can, but you're not going to get a whole lot out of that because, you know, tomatoes and things, those are really heavy feeders. So usually what the remains of the soil in there aren't great. So anyway, when you pull them out, you're going to have quite a bit of space that you're going to need to fill. What we like to do is we fill that space with organic compost, and then on top of the organic compost, we put in a small layer of cured chicken manure. And then I kind of mix up blood and bone meal into you know, like a big bowl, and I'll bring it out and I'll sprinkle that liberally over the top of all of the beds. Once that's done, then I'll throw straw or oak leaves on top of that. In a perfect world, I like to give those beds 4 weeks before I replant them. This year, it looks like I'm going to end up with about three weeks, maybe 2 on some beds. It depends on how long and how much these Roma tomatoes continue to put off. They've gone a lot longer than what I thought. So at this point, we've exceeded the room that we have for our tomatoes for the year, and we've started giving them away. So, you know, while we can give them away, it kind of feels wasteful to pull them. You know, we're not keeping them. We're eating a bunch of cherry tomatoes. We're getting the occasional beefsteak. So we're not hurting for tomatoes, but we do like to leave them in the ground as long as possible, just so that we can get as many tomatoes as we can. We can share with our neighbors and that sort of stuff. So once we have the beds settled, the reason we like to wait the 2 to 4 weeks, you know, like I said, in a perfect world 4 weeks, is because what you want to do is you want to allow those microbes to start multiplying. Microbes are what make your compost, and when you put them in the ground and you put your straw or leaves on top and you add all of your amendments, if you're using organic fertilizers, those microbes will multiply rapidly. They will also start to break down that blood and bone meal into the actual nutrients the way that your plant can use them. So if you give them a 4-week cycle, by the time you put your plants in the ground, you know, they may have 2 or 3 weeks left, but your plants can start off feeding on the compost. And what that does, it gives you somewhat of a buffer area before you have to start using your fertilizer. So even if you go, you know, 5-6 weeks after the first flower without fertilizing, you're not going to hurt your fruit. Now, you'll need to make sure that you get the fertilizer in there by the end of the 7th week after the flower, but you don't have to worry about things like blossom end rot or, you know, we grow a lot of turnips and we grow a lot of beets. And if you don't have the fertilizer in there, you're going to end up with a whole bunch of leaves, which we enjoy eating those. But your tubers underneath, the stuff that you're going to want to cure and save through the wintertime, they won't develop fully. So that's one of the reasons it's really important to give those raised bed time. A lot of people call it rest. And that's a great word for it, really. But really what you're doing whenever you give them that time is allowing those microbes to multiply, which gives your garden bed a much better chance of breaking down those organic materials before your plants need them. And speaking of prepping your beds, August is a great time to start planting your fall gardens. In fact, for us, the first thing we plant in our fall garden are the turnips, and they'll go in mid to late August, so it won't be that long, and we are going to be throwing turnips in the ground. A week after the turnips, we start the beets, and it just kind of windfalls through there all the way up to and including the carrots and lettuce at the end of the cycle. But those are fantastic things to have in the fall. Now, depending on your region, your fall gardens may look substantially different than ours. So it's important now to go ahead and do the research at the first of the month if you never have. If you're a beginning gardener or you're a summer gardener and you'd like to start expanding your growing seasons in the spring and the fall, now is a great time to go through and research your zone. And from there, you can decide, you know, what vegetables do my family and I like, which ones does it make sense to grow in the space that I have, etc., etc. I'll be doing a video next week, I believe, and I'll go over the stuff that we plant in the fall, when to plant it, what the benefits are, when you can plan on taking those vegetables out of the ground and that sort of stuff. So kind of keep a lookout on that. So I believe that this year, our spring and fall gardens, we may actually get more food that we'll eat, you know, that is ready to eat, than we did in our summer gardens. But kind of our summer gardens, we really use it to kind of put a lot of food away for the winter time. We eat, don't get me wrong, we eat a lot of the food, the cucumbers, tomatoes, and that sort of stuff. We eat those daily, but the variety is a little lacking compared to what we get in the spring and the summer. So if you're not a spring and fall gardener, I highly recommend using this time of the year, beginning of August, to do a little bit of research and plan a fall garden. You'll thank me for it.
Hey guys, we were talking this week in this video about August in your garden, and there was a few things I wanted to share with everybody as far as what I prepare for. Of course, you've got the normal, going through your veggies, making sure you've got plans for your fall planting, things like that. And what I like to do is come and investigate my herbs, my perennial plants that I've got growing, and talk about how I prepare for them for the winter time when they go dormant to help protect the root system. So as you can tell, we've talked about my spearmint. It got kind of leggy previously, so I went through, and these are your friend. These are my favorite tools to use. They're quick and easy just to snip back things, and so I just basically take them, and I take, like, for example, these right here you can see are pretty leggy. They're done. There's not new growth at the root system. So what I do is I take them back, and they say about 6 inches from the bottom, and you just trim it off. And then, of course, the chickens enjoy chewing on this. So that's what I do for my spearmint, and you'll see that you get a little bit of new growth, which is good because that'll kind of help the soil and keep the root system going pretty well. You don't want to do this closer to your last frost date, because then the roots don't have time to settle, and so you could lose your whole plant. But that's a good example on this type of perennial for an herb. And I also come out and check my echinacea. After a while, the coneflowers die off, and if you don't trim these off, they'll go to seed. Seeds will fall. You'll have this stuff everywhere. So I just come out and I'll take my trimmers, and I want to go above one of the leaf nodes, and I'll just take that portion off. And as these die off, I'll come out and trim more, and you can save these and use them for the seed heads for next year if you'd like. Although this is a perennial, it's going to come back and it's going to be just as beautiful the next year. So that's just kind of an example of what I do to prepare, and I've got plenty more to do. So thank you for watching
this week's video here. Just a few things I'd like to add at the end. It's really important in August to make sure that you continue your fertilizing. Another thing that I like to do in August is I like to take stock of where I'm at in the garden, the things that have worked up to this point and the things that haven't. We'll also do a video on that towards the end of August. I want to take stock of our summer vegetable garden, and we'll put all that on here and kind of let you know what worked and what didn't. But now is a great time, if it's your first time doing a garden, or if you have a garden that's in a new area, or perhaps you planted something that you're unfamiliar with and this is the first time that you've grown it. August is a great time to sit down and take notes of what worked, what didn't work, what you would have changed, that sort of thing. So that next year, if you decide to grow that thing, or you decide not to, you'll have notes to kind of let you know why. August is also a time of year to where if you bought chickens in the early spring, now is when you're going to start getting a lot of eggs. And I bring this up in a gardening video because if you're like us and you have some raised bed gardens that your chickens can access, make sure that you're looking through there every few days to make sure they haven't put a nest in, because, well, ours have. I think that's about it. Oh, one last thing. August is a really important time to keep an eye on your fruit trees. Because again, whenever it comes down to the drought, a lot of things are going to run out of food this time of year, and your apples or your pears that are going to be ripening here for you to eat in a few weeks, those are very tempting treats right now for some of those pests. Well, having said all that, I would just like to say thank you to all you folks that have made it here to the end. We appreciate it as always. If you have not, please consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us out a lot and it's free for you. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like. Until next time, I hope that all you folks take care of yourselves.